poor people especially, make and sustain their livelihoods on the intersection with power, with institutions, with political economy, and there's nobody better placed to do that than Ian Scoones. He's the director of the STEP Center. His disciplinary background is in agroecology, but he's worked in a very interdisciplinary way. He's the director of the STEP Center and has used science policy interface, looking at social aspects, institutional aspects, to study land, agriculture, and has a long background in Zimbabwe, 3 decades of work. And you're heading to Zimbabwe this afternoon, so we're lucky tomorrow. So we're very happy to have him here today. Thanks a lot, Ian.
Great, thank you, Lila, and thank you, Julia. And thank you for all showing up on a grim English autumn day and after what sounded like a pretty full-on week last week. Today, as Lila said, I'm going to be talking about livelihoods and development, and I'm going to do this through a series of steps in my talk, starting with some reflections on how ideas travel over time, and in particular reflecting on how ideas in policy processes get transformed and how the politics of development is framed. I think this is nicely illustrated by the livelihood story, but could be relevant to any of the other ideas you've been reflecting on in this series of talks. And then I want to introduce you to what became called the sustainable livelihoods approach and develop a critique of this from a more political economy perspective, sort of thing that I've been thinking about, and then reflect on that in turn with some examples, or a particular example of how that type of perspective can be applied in practice, with a little bit of a case study from some of my work with colleagues in Zimbabwe. And then I want to conclude in and around some forward-looking perspective suggestions about how this debate about livelihoods and development might go into the future. So during the talk, I want you to think about these themes, think about how livelihoods approaches can be used and how they might be used in the context that you work, but think also at a slightly broader level about the way ideas in development travel and become necessarily political. Now, we'll have plenty of time, I hope, at the end to discuss, but if there are any bits that you find unclear and want me to repeat or explain, please put up your hand and interrupt me. That's absolutely fine. Now, this is a word cloud from quite a famous paper from the end of the 1990s promoting what became then the sustainable livelihoods approach. Now, I wonder how many in this room have heard of the sustainable livelihoods approach before doing your readings? So a few, oh yeah, quite a few, more than last year. That's intriguing. Because it became a really central set of debates in development in the 90s and early 2000s, and became quite an organising concept for quite a few development agencies, NGOs and others, as I'll come to in a minute. But what, for the advocates of a livelihoods approach, and I put myself amongst them, actually stand out from to define a livelihoods approach? I think the primary characteristic is that a livelihoods approach start with people and the places they live. They attempt to cut across boundaries that so often divide our world, particularly in development, and look at how people make their living, which obviously often involves combining agriculture, wage employment, farm labour, small-scale enterprise, and so on. In reality, people do a range of things. They create a bricolage, if you like, of different activities. Now, Henry Bernstein, years ago, from a Marxist perspective, talking largely about classes of labour, developed an argument about why a livelihoods approach is necessary. And just to quote from one of his papers from the late 2000s, He says, many of the world's poor seek livelihoods through insecure, oppressive, and increasingly informalized wage employment, and or a range of likewise precarious, small-scale and insecure informal sector survival activity, including farming. In effect, various and complex combinations of employment and self-employment. Many of the labouring poor do this across sites of the social division of labour, urban and rural, agricultural and non-agricultural, as well as wage employment and self-employment. This defies the inherited assumptions of fixed, let alone uniform notions and identities of worker, trader, urban, rural, employed and self-employed. In sum, it makes understanding the complexities of life today in many settings, including in contexts such as the UK, makes a livelihoods approach that cuts across these boundaries that we normally think about planning and development absolutely essential. And in respect of livelihoods, we can think about locales, rural and urban, and the intersections between them, about occupations, farming, pastoral, fishing, other livelihoods, around social difference, gendered livelihoods, age-defined livelihoods, around livelihoods that are defined in relation to directions, pathways, trajectories, and in relation to dynamic patterns, sustainable or resilient livelihoods, and many, many more. Livelihoods has been attached to many, many descriptors, and I think can be useful in that way. At one level, all this is, as it were, blindingly obvious. Of course, everyone has complex livelihoods. Of course, we shouldn't think in sectoral silos. Of course, we should think across the divides of rural and urban and so on. Of course, we should think about gender dynamics within our understandings of employment and labour. But of course, it's easy to say, but in practice, we know that that's often very different, because the bureaucratic, institutional planning regimes that often divide the world often construct divisions that don't reflect the complexities of the real world out there. So I think livelihoods as a term has become quite useful in the last couple of decades in development, acting in a sense as a boundary term to encourage this debate about bringing disparate perspectives together between the economists and the social anthropologists, the geographers, the gender studies people, and so on. Connecting disciplinary and professional and sectoral divides in ways that become like an institutional bridging function. But there's of course a politics to how ideas like this, which at one level seem quite obvious, travel and get institutionalized. And that's what I want to have this next bit of the lecture focus on. A very, very brief history of how livelihoods debates have evolved over time. I could have started anywhere, but I want to start in the 1940s in Zambia, then Northern Rhodesia, part of the British colonies, where an institute called the Rhodes Livingston Institute was set up essentially to support research for colonial administration. Now, besides the imperial designs of colonial administration, what they did, of course, was to try and understand the complexities of life in this case, rural Zambia, through an approach that had all the hallmarks, although it wasn't called, a livelihoods approach. And if you go back to those writings of the anthropologists and others who were working in Zambia at that time, you see it's all about integrative, cross-sectoral, locally embedded, people-orientated approaches with a deep field engagement to try and understand rural complexity. But of course, that was a particular period before development became called development. But why didn't that persist as development as a concept became institutionalized in places like IDS and beyond? Well, one of the explanations was the emergence of the infrastructure of development after the Second World War. Policy advice to Western development agencies was increasingly influenced by a particular type of professional economist rather than those generalist rural development administrators that supported development administration in the past. the post-war institutions of the World Bank, the IMF, the UN system, the bilateral aid agencies, and many independent national governments in the global south reflected this hegemony of a particular way of thinking, linking economics with specialist technical disciplines and therefore a siloed, often very siloed approach. The alternative sources of this broader integrated social science expertise, and particularly the cross-disciplinary livelihoods frameworks, rather disappeared off the scene. But not completely so, and I'm glad to say that in places like IDS through the 70s and into the 80s, there was the sustaining of a more integrated approach that had this sensibility around people and place and livelihood complexity. And this drew on cross-disciplinary research and particularly drew on longitudinal analysis, sticking it out and trying to understand how things changed in particular places over time. And in 1992, there was a very famous IDS working paper by Gordon Conway and Robert Chambers, the latter who you've met, I'm sure, reflecting on what they called then sustainable livelihoods. This built very much on Robert's earlier work and his classic book, Rural Development, Putting the Last First. And if you've never read it, it was published in 1983. Students often in 2016 only read things up to from about 2014. But I would recommend going back to that. 1983, it was that book actually got me into development. Before then, I was a conservation biologist. So read it. 1992, of course, was the year of the Rio Environment and Development Summit. And, of course, debates about sustainability and development, very hot again these days, were very much the flavour of the era. And through discussions that Gordon and Robert had with many people, including M.S. Swaminathan and others, they came up with this idea of sustainable livelihoods and fed that into the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, that was published in 1986. And the IDS working paper of 1992 came out of that and really put onto the table, in the midst of this period where the Washington Consensus and the post-war array of institutions that I just mentioned were hegemonic, put onto the table a different way of thinking. And they defined livelihoods in this way. A livelihood comprises the capabilities, assets, including both material and social resources, drawing on Amartya Sen on capabilities, of course, and activities for a means of living. A livelihood is sustainable when it can cope with and recover from stresses and shocks. Those of you engaging with climate adaptation and resilience debates will recognize that phraseology. And maintain and enhance capabilities and assets while not undermining the natural resource base. So combining the strands of ecology and development studies, entitlements thinking from Sen was the core of this early definition, which is sustained pretty well, of sustainable livelihoods. Now, in terms of our sort of overall history of this debate, the mid-1990s then provided an opportunity, after this sort of intellectual discussion and the moment of Rio, the Rio event, for these ideas to become institutionalized. And that happened with the emergence of, in this country, DFID, the Department for International Development, for the first time for ever, I think, a cabinet office position and a separate ministry. That became, in its first white paper under Minister Claire Short in 1997, sustainable livelihoods became one of the central pillars of their aid programming around poverty reduction and so on. Now, if you read DFID documents today, that seems like ancient history, but it was very much part of the history of this idea at that moment. And of course, at that moment, oh my goodness, where did that go? Oh dear. Oh. Rather than pressing it that way, you have to press it that way. I don't know. Certain non-linear version of my talk. Anyway, so at that moment, this idea became institutionalized and became inserted into bureaucracies. Now, thinking about how ideas travel, they can circulate amongst academics and others, but when they enter bureaucracies, when they enter organizations, and these are just some of them, who took up sustainable livelihoods in the late 90s, early 2000s, as a central part of their programming, various things happen inevitably. The ideas change from a sort of fairly fluid debate to a framework with capital letters. As they get appropriated by particular professional alliances within bureaucracies, they become their thing, and other people object to them. When big budgets, and very big budgets, get attached to this, the nuance and the sophistication of the debate that perhaps we had at IDS get lost out when they get rolled out at scale by different agencies. And then there's a dependency culture that evolves around a big idea in development. You all know it. You probably lived off some of it for a while, of consultants, of trainers, of all the rest of the development business who make livings out of ideas. But I think actually in this period, the livelihoods debate did make a difference. I mean, I've been cynical and critical in my last comments, appropriately so, but I think it did make a difference. It did open up a debate in agencies that had really got stuck in that modality of the post-war Washington consensus approach, and cross-sector, cross-discipline, locally led, participatory work became acceptable and indeed substantially funded. And it was a real challenge to some of the conventional development. But of course, these things go in cycles. So by the mid-2000s, mid-late 2000s, there was a rising critique of this sort of approach. It came from a number of fronts. The critique was academic, to saying this was a fairly instrumental, functionalist approach that didn't really deal with politics and power. Although as an originator of some of the earlier ideas, I agreed with that. There was a bureaucratic response. It's all well and good you guys saying do everything cross sectors and integrated, but how on earth do we organize this? We have ministries of agriculture, we have ministries of finance and so on and so forth. How on earth can we actually do this in practice? And it came from a sense that the world had changed and that the aid modalities needed to change with this. That this approach of projects and local level development supported by international aid agencies and NGOs was not necessarily the way to go. That in fact the best way that aid money could be spent was in budget support around wider forms of conditionality to support governments to do things themselves. And I think there was some good arguments behind that as well. And the world had changed as well. Everything couldn't be solved at a local level. This was the context of another phase of rapid globalization, of climate change, of international global problems that a local level livelihoods approach perhaps was not well equipped to deal with. And again, I agree to some degree with that. But I think after that sort of downturn in the 2000s and into this decade, I think there has been a change of perspective, galvanized to some degree by the SDG process, the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are the 17 goals. And if you read a lot of the SDG documentation, you could easily think that this was livelihoods reinvented. It's about cross-sectoral. It's about, Robert's term was putting the last first. The SDG slogan is leave no one behind. It sounds pretty similar, doesn't it? So I think the SDGs do provide an opportunity to actually regalvanize some attention to this, and as governments have signed up to the SDGs, to really push the thinking about how SDGs aren't just singular goals, but actually represent together the challenges for humanity. And it's the relationships between the goals that become really significant in thinking through. So my hope is that the SDGs will provide a platform for revitalizing livelihoods perspectives after the period that I just described. But, of course, in the politics of ideas, there are countervailing positions. I think in the post-Brexit, post-Trump era, the SDGs may not have as much purchase as we thought at the end of 2015, when they were signed with great celebration. So, how do we think about ideas and policy process? All this term you've been thinking about big development ideas and their relationships to policy. Well, I want to offer you three overlapping circles to think about it in a rather simplistic way. To think a little bit about how an idea travels. In my little potted history from the 1940s to today, we've seen how the framing of livelihoods approaches have been connected to policy in different ways. And at certain points they gain ascendancy, and at certain points they don't. Now, to understand that, one has to understand the politics of knowledge and the politics of bureaucracy and the politics of interests. So, how do ideas travel over time? We found it useful in thinking about policy processes and thinking about how policy processes at certain moments open up and broaden out for different ideas, and at other times close in and close down, and narrow down rather, in relation to three forms of power that underpin policy. Power that emerges through discourse, the way we talk about the world and the way the world is talked about by different groups of people. Second, through how power is exerted through relationships of actors in networks, and how those coalesce at certain moments around particular coalitions and alliances that are not necessarily coincident with states and NGOs and so on, but may cut right across, as happened with the livelihoods approaches at certain moments, and I hope will happen again with the SDGs, and in and around a more conventional political science analysis of interests. Who benefits, who loses out of the processes of change. And that is essentially around political, commercial, professional and other interests about who is likely to support a particular idea. And if one imagines a policy space in the middle of those three circles, one can imagine it opening up and closing down in and around the way these three dimensions of power intersect. Now, if you're going to follow the Sustainability and Policy Processes course next term, you'll hear lots more about these three circles and apply them and think about them in relation to a whole bunch of different examples. But it's worth reflecting in the terms of this lecture about how livelihoods have changed over time since the 1940s through this interaction of discourses, actors, networks, politics, interests. And as I mentioned today, we see, as it were, a clash between different frames, different discourses about what development should be. The SDG perspective perhaps more aligned to livelihoods, but sustainable livelihoods perspectives. The approach that perhaps is currently being pushed by the UK government and likely to be pushed by a Trump government in the US is likely to be more about trade and Western self-interest and the expansion of a particular type of relationship rather than addressing livelihoods and poverty per se. So that's my little offer of a first framework for thinking. And the end of my little excursion into the brief history of livelihoods thinking. Here is another framework, and this is what became called the livelihoods framework. And you saw a whole bunch of incarnations of it in an earlier slide as it evolved. Now, I'm not going to explain all the details of this. You can read up on this if you wish. But I want to explain a little bit about where it came from and what we were thinking about when we produced it. In the mid-1990s, I was involved with colleagues here at IDS, but also with colleagues in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Mali in a multidisciplinary team that was really trying to think about how do you understand complex livelihoods in changing settings, rural settings in this case, in a comparative way. And we sat in various rooms around IDS and in Bangladesh and Ethiopia and Mali, and we're puzzling over how do we bring a very diverse group of people together to think about this. And in a way, this framework, although it looks very complicated, and at one level it is, asks a very simple question. Starting on the left-hand side with context, in any given context, it asks, what combination of livelihood assets, these are the capitals, or labelled here livelihood resources, lead to what livelihood strategies, the bit where we're looking at agriculture, livelihoods, diversification and migration, mediated by what institutions and organizations, the grey bit in the middle, and ultimately to what outcomes. So a fairly simple question. But obviously underneath that question there's a lot more. So it can ask, well, what are the assets? What are the various combinations of so-called capitals? And some people adapted this diagram to put that in a pentagon, which caused all sorts of confusion to all sorts of people. One could look at the institutions and organizations, the bit that we emphasized in our work in IDS, because we were interested in what are the mediating processes, political, social, relational, that affect the ability of people to make use of assets for their different strategies. And one could look at outcomes, thinking about how poverty indicators or livelihood indicators can be combined in different ways with sustainability indicators, a challenge which is very central to the SDG debate at the moment. It was also a useful way of bringing together different disciplines, and that's often the challenge in a lot of development work. We pride ourselves with development studies being cross-disciplinary, but actually most people out there have a particular disciplinary base, and they're coming from it, and I'm sure many of you do. So the economists amongst you will recognize an interest in relating inputs to outputs through a sort of modeling approach. I mean, inputs could be capitals, outputs could be strategies, and turn linked to outcomes. Whereas the social anthropologists, sociologists, and others amongst you may be much more interested in the relational questions in the middle, the institutions, the organizations, the power relations that go on within families, within villages, within districts, and so on, that affect the way livelihoods pan out. The geographers amongst you might be interested in the wider landscape and the scale questions of place and time that affect context, but also affect the whole process here. And those of you who come from a sustainability science or an ecology background may be interested in how the particular contexts and conditions, whether that be climate change or soil quality or whatever, affect how livelihoods can be played out. So everyone, if you like, has a space in this diagram, and that's helpful, but it also can be confusing. And of course, a lot of the debate in livelihoods thinking is about how do you get people together to have a debate about this, about simple questions. Some people thought that the livelihoods framework was going to solve development problems. It can't, quite clearly. What it can do is provoke a series of questions about where livelihoods are being carved out, about what social relations are important, about what temporal, seasonal factors that affect the dynamics of livelihood change, and so on. And a massive body of literature. If you just type in livelihoods into Google Scholar, you'll be absolutely horrified by the amount that comes out. But I think there was a limit to a lot of this stuff. It was quite descriptive, it was quite local level, it was quite, at one level, apolitical, although we tried to introduce politics into this. And it became, as I mentioned before, instrumentalized within the aid bureaucracy. So I want to now ask, how do we inject a bit more of the politics into this? Because actually all of these questions, whether it's about the nature of the capital assets, whether it's about the nature of the strategies, whether it's about the nature of the outcomes, are all affected by political economic factors and their interactions. So I want to get some help here from a man with a grey beard. I don't know how many times Karl Marx has been mentioned in the Ideas lectures to date. Probably not very much, I suspect. But Karl Marx had an enormous amount to say about development, even though he was writing long before development was called development. And I want to turn even further back than the 1940s to the mid-1800s, when Marx was thinking about political economy method. In a very different context to where we often work, but in industrializing England. And we often forget some of the insights from the classical political economists in development studies, as we've lost that in a particular intellectual trajectory. But in thinking about method, he wrote this fantastic book, which is quite difficult to read, but there have been various interpretations of it. Most of Marx is very difficult to read, called the Grundrisse, which was his underpinning argument around method in political economy. And very many people take, in a way, a rather vulgar approach to Marx, assuming that all he was talking about was big picture, structural, historical patterns, which of course he was, but he was also interested in how these emerge in time, and that was, as it were, his perspective on dialectics. He was interested in, to quote him from the Grundrisse, in what he called the multiple determinations and relations, which give rise to these broader patterns. And in arguing for a critical political economy, he wanted to expose these rich totalities of determinations and relations, and expose through a historical analysis of these what he called the concrete. Not as he called it, chaotic conception of the whole, i.e. anything goes, but something that has pattern underlying it, informed by history. The concentration of many determinations, hence, as he called it, the unity of the diverse. Now, I don't want to get detracted down a whole Marxist analysis of the Grundrisse, but my point is that actually in the broad corpus of thinking that goes into development studies, and you'd be surprised in the 1970s, you ask Mick Moore next week, the place was full of Marxists. These ideas have some purchase, and I think can actually be really, really helpful for livelihoods thinking. Because livelihoods thinking, I think, was very much about the multiple determinations and relations, but less about the concrete patterns that emerged out of them. So very often we got stuck in the minute descriptions of what happened in a particular village or household or whatever, and lost the bigger picture of what emerged in structural relations of class, of gender relations, of age and generational relations that emerged out of that. Obviously, Marx was particularly focused on class, but of course many commentators on Marxism since have argued that, of course, there's an intersectional relationship between class, gender, age, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on. Now, I mentioned Henry Bernstein before because he has quite a sensitivity to livelihoods approaches, but it also comes from the tradition of Marxist agrarian economy, political economy. And he argues in his book on agrarian political economy, it's this movement between the diverse specifics of particular livelihood contexts and these wider abstractions and tendencies associated with a dynamic understanding of class and other relations, that important insights into longer-term trajectories emerge. Because I think often when we get stuck in the particular descriptives of particular settings, we miss that longer-term analysis that can emerge out of this sort of what Stuart Hall calls a historical epistemology. Anyway, that's some of my lessons from a rereading of the Grundrisse, and I think can be brought back into some of this livelihoods thinking. That we don't lose the detailed specificities of everyday life and understanding all of the complexities of what people do, but we have to relate that to a more concrete understanding of processes of change and bring that firmly into livelihoods analysis. So what questions does this suggest? Well, at root it's actually fairly simple, and Henry again, I draw on here, came up with at least 4 of these questions in his writings, sort of distilling down for those of us who find reading great treatises of Marxist political economy a bit hard work, to some basic questions that we can ask of any setting. And you didn't know that the whole of Capital and all the rest of it could be distilled onto one slide. Well, not quite, but here's an attempt, thanks to Henry Bernstein. So one can ask, who owns what? Very basic questions about access, relating to the livelihood assets in the livelihoods framework, questions of property and ownership of the different capitals, if you like, and assets and resources. We can ask who does what. This relates to the livelihood strategies in the framework, the social divisions of labour, the relationship between productive and reproductive labour, those who are employed in wage labour and those who are employed, self-employed or unemployed, as well as the gender divisions of all of it. Who gets what? This relates to questions of income and its distribution and the livelihood outcomes of the framework. What do they do with it? This relates to the array of livelihood strategies and their consequences as reflected in consumption, social reproduction, and in accumulation, including savings for investment, the drivers of class formation. And in addition to these 4, which Henry mentioned, we added another 2 from our work, looking at relationships between state and society, asking how social relations in society between citizens and the state affect livelihoods, and in particular the institutional aspects of that. That's the middle of the framework. And finally, linking to political ecology, if you like, and the dynamic ecologies that affect livelihoods. This relates to environmental questions and again the sustainability dimension of livelihoods thinking. And I found these questions really useful because they come from a longer tradition of theoretical thinking, but they are questions that we can ask practically in particular settings. And they can be applied, as you see in this diagram, to the original framework that we came up with in the mid-90s, to push that a little bit further and relate it to this more political economic analysis. Now I want to move to an example to illustrate how this might be done and how we might link what Marx would call the multiple determinations and relations of complex realities of livelihoods with the concrete emergent structural forms that are addressed by these type of questions. And this, as Lila intimated before, comes from my work in Zimbabwe, which I've been doing for shocking length of time with colleagues there, looking at environment and development issues, and most recently around lands and agrarian reform questions. And I can't go into all of that. You can read more in the books and websites and whatnot. But what we've done, I think, over time, to distill it down, again, very simply, is do three things in an overlapping way in our research, which I think has been helpful and reflective of this sort of methodological stance that I think is necessary for a more political perspective on livelihoods thinking. We can't miss out on what we've always done, and done effectively, I think, through livelihoods frameworks, a basic descriptive livelihoods analysis, answering those questions: who does what, who owns what, who gets what, linking to patterns of production, labour, social reproduction, and the rest. That's crucial. That's the multiple determinations and relations that one has to start with. But we also have to understand where that's going, and try and understand that in relation to livelihood change. And we've used various livelihood classifications. There's one that Andrew Dorwood and colleagues came up with that classifies between people stepping up, stepping out, hanging in, dropping out. The basic question of what do they do with all of this, and how does it affect patterns of accumulation and social differentiation. And extended forms of accumulation, of course, create the conditions for the formation of new forms of classes, which is the third dimension, which is the move to the concrete features, to understand the patterns, the structural features that emerge out of this, class, gender, age, and so on, intersectionally combined, and with that, a broader understanding of the dynamics of change, and indeed the intersections with environments and ecologies. Because our basic question was, in this work since 2000 at least, is what happened to people after they got land through the land reform that happened in Zimbabwe in 2000. And what was going to happen into the future? What forms of change were happening which would have implications for the trajectories of livelihoods and development, with implications, of course, for policy. Now, let me give you, I don't have to look at the detail of this, that's not so relevant, but this is, as it were, a summary table of lots and lots of data that came from surveys. We've had a number of surveys right across the country. We've also looked at more qualitative analysis to understand what people are doing. But this is a sort of distillation of that, looking in the middle of the various livelihood strategies, what people were doing, but also trying to think about how they were clustered in terms of different livelihood categories. And then in turn thinking about, well, what does that mean for the patterns of change in this particular setting? Now, there's a very particular setting in Zimbabwe, but I think the broad methodology and thinking behind it could be usefully applied elsewhere. So we came back to the framework and the associated questions and asked in relation to this, well, how does this all fit together? What are the dynamic changes that are evolving in these rural settings in Zimbabwe over time? And we've been following households in these case study sites now for 16 years, and that's what I'm going to go and do tomorrow, is go with the team and revisit a number of the sites and continue the study in that longitudinal way to try and understand this dynamic more thoroughly. But we were able to draw out of this, well, who was emerging as a result of getting this land as what we call middle farmers. I mean, that's a Lenin's term, but middle farmers who were accumulating, not necessarily rich, but not necessarily really dirt poor, but accumulating in some way and becoming petty commodity producers from below, making use of land and reinvesting and accumulating through particular labour and market dynamics. We were able to ask, who were the groups who were accumulating from above? Who were the people who had made use of land but were using patronage and political connections to accumulate, rather than accumulating from below? And how did that particular class politics and the conflicts between those groups play out in the politics of agrarian change? we were able to ask what were the gender and age relations that cut across this. How were different groups of people, different ages, different genders, able to accumulate, able to make use of patronage opportunities, able to accumulate from below from investment in farming? And how did that differentiate? And we were able to ask, well, who wasn't managing in this process and why? Because not everyone was doing well. There was a good number of people who were doing well as a result of the land reform, but not everyone. We saw in the previous slide those who were hanging in or indeed dropping out. So from tracking our sample and talking to people, we were able to ask, well, who wasn't? And what type of support might they need in respect to the type of assets, the type of institutional support, going back to the livelihoods framework, to ensure that a hanging in livelihood could be transformed into one that allowed stepping up and a form of accumulation. So a whole set of questions in relation to policy around social protection, about targeted support and so on, but situated in this broader understanding of the dynamics of change. And we were also able to ask, well, what are this dynamics of accumulation? We've identified in these smallholder land reform areas a pattern of relatively successful accumulation based on small-scale farming and trade. Not everyone, but quite a few. What's the limits of this? How sustainable is this over time and across generations? So we were able to look across generationally at youth and people in these households as to what their prospects were for setting off on a pattern of accumulation, moving out of poverty in the development language. So I think all of this, situated within the livelihoods framework, asking these political economy questions, has been, in my assessment, quite useful. It's useful analytically because it combines the multiple determinations, the details of what's going on the ground, with a more structural analysis of agrarian change in terms of class, gender, and so on. But it's also useful in respect to policy because we can say some quite concrete things about what type of assets need to be invested where, which institutional arrangements work, in terms of outcomes, what type of monitoring and evaluation systems become appropriate, and so on. So that's my little section of the talk about how a political economy approach, drawing on Marxist and other perspectives, might allow us to move to a slightly deeper analysis of the livelihoods framework. So my second part of the talk. How am I doing for time? Not too bad. My last part of the talk is essentially about where do we go now and what does this mean. And this will be a relatively short run through some themes that I put about in this little red book on sustainable livelihoods and rural development, which was produced as part of the Agrarian Change and Peasant Studies series. Probably the most difficult book I've ever written in my life, actually, because the deal was it had to be 40,000 words long. It's not very long for a book. It had to be relatively easy to understand, and it had to cover absolutely everything I'd ever thought about livelihoods and so on. So you're getting a distilled version of that in this talk. But at the end of it, one of the challenges was, and it came out to some extent in an earlier paper I did for the Journal of Peasant Studies, where does all this debate about livelihoods go? Because we've had these phases, we've had this recognition both in aid policy and in academic thinking that livelihoods approaches are quite useful. We've had this critique, elements of which I've just presented, but where does it go now, and how do you inject what everyone says is needed, a politics back into livelihoods approaches that make it useful and worthwhile? And here, these are just really speculative ideas, but how do we think about politics in respect of livelihoods? And what are the dimensions of politics that are going to be useful? And there are four that I want to mention. Let's race straight into each of them. First, the politics of interests. I've mentioned this before in respect of understanding policy processes. I mention it again in respect of understanding political economy. But let me reflect on it again now in respect of livelihoods thinking more broadly. Politics isn't just context. Some people put using that livelihoods frame, oh, well, politics is just the context for which all of this happens. Some people say, well, politics should be another capital, it's an asset on which people draw. Well, that's fine. Both of those are true. But I think politics is actually much more fundamental, as I've tried to argue. Interests are much more fundamental, as I've tried to argue in the previous section of the talk. Because unless one can examine the wider structures of inequality that, as it were, structure the ability for people to make livelihoods, and the relations of class, race, gender, and so on that I mentioned before, we're going to miss out on how livelihoods are always co-constituted with interests and wider political economy factors. And the history, of course, as Marx and many others have taught us, really does matter. Because it's the nature of the state, the influence of private capital, the terms of trade, alongside a whole array of other structural features that affect the ability of people to make livelihoods. And I think this was a legitimate part of the earlier critique, the ignoring of the changing dimensions of globalization and their effects on livelihood possibilities, that we got a little bit stuck at the local level and didn't try and understand how this was all playing out. And as I expressed in the discussion around policy processes, in order to understand how opportunities in policy open up for progressive, livelihoods-orientated approaches, we need to understand how interests impinge. So I think a politics of interests needs to run right through our thinking of livelihoods in different ways. But we shouldn't always think of politics just as something that exists out there, up there in the realms of big structural power. Politics is also in individuals and in relations. And of course, feminist studies have long taught us that. And I think those insights need to be brought firmly and securely into livelihoods thinking. And I don't think have been as much as they should have done. Because there is a politics of the individual in the diverse lived realities of different people in different places. It's that day-to-day experience of practices that allow people to have certain livelihoods and not. So, well-being, broadly understood, emerges from not just the material access to a bit of land or a bit of money, but also the social, psychological, emotional, affective dimensions of living and livelihoods. Who we are, how we feel, what others think of us, our life worlds, our identities, our subjectivities, our experiences, called in some literatures the affective politics of livelihoods, including, of course, the politics of the body, of gender, of sexuality, and so on. So I think, a lot of our thinking in livelihoods has been a little bit material, a little bit instrumental, and not informed as well as it might be by those strands of theory in cultural studies, in feminist studies, and beyond. And of course, beyond the politics of rights and access, there is, as Nancy Fraser has long pointed out, a politics of recognition. Important dimensions of lives and livelihoods of people, particularly marginalised people and poor people, where a politics of recognition becomes absolutely crucial to well-being. Third, there's a politics of knowledge in all of this, and I've hinted at this in the story of livelihoods over time, but it goes beyond that. How we understand livelihoods and how livelihoods are framed by different people becomes really quite crucial in policy more broadly. Because livelihoods can be framed in different settings as good or bad livelihoods, deviant livelihoods or acceptable livelihoods, proper livelihoods, modern livelihoods, backward livelihoods. All of these are terms that cast a particular view rooted in a politics of knowledge about how we think the world should be. And we see this in relation to a whole array of occupations and trades that people, and again particularly poor people, have to pursue in order to make a living that may be illegal or unacceptable in certain normative frames. So we need to understand how a politics of knowledge impinges on how we think about interventions around livelihoods and whether we are being affected by that in particular ways. Because it also will affect how we think about change, and livelihood framings and directions of change can be understood in relation to how we think about what livelihoods are good, bad, indifferent and poor. So I think a constructivist analysis of knowledge and politics, as I've tried to make clear earlier on, is essential and needs to be embedded in our livelihoods thinking. Fourth, a politics of ecology. I come from a natural sciences, biology background originally, and very often in development, environment has always been tacked on as a sort of add-on. But of course, ecology shapes politics and politics shapes ecology. We ignore those relationships at our peril, I think, particularly in the era of climate change, but in relation to other environmental factors as well. And livelihoods in rural settings, and indeed urban settings, are constructed across very dynamic ecological contexts. There's no sort of simple, stable, equilibrial, blank slate on which livelihoods are built. Livelihoods, again, particularly for marginal and marginalised people, have to be constructed in highly variable environments, often subject to sudden changes and shifts, and more so with climate change, I would expect. So we have to think about livelihoods also in relation to dynamic thresholds, tipping points and so on, as comes out of the literatures on socio-ecology and sustainability science. So issues of sustainability, and therefore sustainable livelihoods, are absolutely about people and places, and very often our colleagues in the natural sciences separate off people, just as people in the social sciences separate off environments. And that's wrong, because sustainability must be about the co-constitution of both, about the practices of production, consumption and their relationships. So livelihood sustainability must be always about nimble, responsive, informed negotiation with different environments and maintaining and different objectives. In the STEP Centre we talk about pathways to sustainability very much as a co-constructed negotiation of social goals, environmental goals, personal goals and more global goals. Transformations towards just sustainabilities are about competing different pathways and, as with the SDGs, negotiations between them. So I think in a reinvigorated livelihoods approach with politics at its centre, we mustn't forget ecology too. So across all these dimensions, livelihoods and politics must come together. And I think this then pushes us to think about livelihoods approaches drawing on the old framework and the old understandings of livelihoods about people in places. We need to focus both on those multiple determinations and relations, what people do and how they make a living, but also on the concrete dimensions of power that limit or provide opportunities for different livelihood trajectories. And that's that relationship, classic relationship in social science, between agency and practice and what goes on in a particular place, and wider structural political dimensions that become crucial. So in this little book that I mentioned before, I argue that this new political economy requires innovations in methods and practice and presents us with some normative challenges. But I think it also presents us a challenge to think about sustainable livelihoods, particularly in the current context and debates about what development is and how it's framed, in a way that is about justice, about politics, about rights, and about recognition in the ways that I've talked about. And as a way of translating, if you like, the very high-sounding rhetoric of the SDGs, which is all about, the globe and humanity, into something a little bit more tangible and realizable on the ground, with some methods, some concepts, some ideas that are informed by a long history of discussions that can counter some of the other perspectives on development that we see from other quarters. This is another word cloud, this time from a bit of this book, and you can see, if you compare the two, some changes in the way the discourse is presented and the words are combined. So that's all I have to say now, and I hope I've left enough time. I can't even remember when we finish, but enough time to have a decent discussion and perhaps probe some of the questions that you'll be discussing in your groups, as I understand it, later on today. Perhaps questions about what does a livelihoods approach mean in your context. Perhaps some questions about how we understand ideas more generally in the context of policy, or just some questions about things that you didn't understand about what I said, or indeed disagreements, even better, and we can have a discussion. Yeah, please, let's have a... You're going to have to shout. I don't think there's any microphones or anything fancy like that. Politics of ecology playing out. Okay, so a real life example of the way ecology and politics plays out. Well, I mean, we could take many examples around the climate change debate, obviously, where, of course, rapid climate change, the effects of climate change as affecting livelihoods in different parts of the planet, is radically restructuring the way people are able to make their livelihoods. But, of course, then climate change is in turn affected by the way people make their livelihoods, so production and consumption and so on. So livelihoods and climate change and livelihoods are always intersecting with each other. That's at a slightly broad level, but I think one shouldn't think of climate change as simply something that is exogenously emerging, but is actually always created by different patterns of production, consumption, and so on. But at a more sort of local level, let's take an example of some of the work that we did on soils management, for example. So farmers in different parts of the world have, access to different sources of soils and for their farming, which of course is ecologically defined at one level. So we have different types of soils which can produce different types of crops and so on and so forth. So a soil scientist looking at that will say, well, that's all defined by soil ecology and soil chemistry and so on. But actually, if you look at it the other way, soils are always the result of long-term, in farming settings, long-term investments by farmers. So the portion of soil around my homestead, for example, may have had decades of house waste or manure of various sorts applied to it. So it'd be very rich and therefore useful for a particular type of crops. Other areas of the landscape may be relatively degraded because they are not, they haven't been managed by a, in this case, a private management system, but are heavily grazed and managed by all sorts of people's village cattle from all over, therefore a different tenure regime. So therefore you get soils in a landscape affected by tenure, around access, around histories of investment in soil improvement. So these are not just, from the soil scientists or soil chemists' point of view, patterns of soils which are, as it were, ecologically defined. They're actually socially defined, institutionally defined by tenure, by politics and so on. So political ecology looks at both of those. One has to understand the soil chemistry and soil biology and patterns of soils in a variegated sense, but one has also to understand that that landscape is socially, historically, institutionally constructed. So therefore any intervention shouldn't just come from the soil science perspective, it must come from that dual understanding of how soils are constructed in a historical way. So whether you're looking at climate change at that much broader level, one has to understand both how ecology constructs politics and politics constructs ecology, or at the very local level, one has to understand the same dynamic. And that's essentially what political ecology, a strand that emerged out of geography and ecology, does quite effectively, and why that is actually a very useful route into some thinking around livelihoods. Other questions? Yeah.
Is the sustainable livelihoods approach also used in developed countries like in Europe?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I gave examples from Zimbabwe and various other places, but there's absolutely no reason why, and indeed it has been, be applied to Brighton or any places in the global north. Because the same dynamics apply. Increasingly, the description that I gave of this, the form of livelihoods being neither wage employed nor fragile livelihoods being constructed from a variety of different sources, that applies in austerity Britain as it does to rural Africa. So actually a livelihoods approaches and the framework itself have been widely applied in quite interesting ways. And I think have informed social policy in quite interesting ways. And the most exciting exchanges have happened when colleagues from Africa or India, wherever, have come to the global north and done livelihoods analyses in settings of urban Europe to investigate these type of challenges. And there's often a real aha moment saying, well, actually, poverty in Britain is not hugely different to poverty elsewhere. People on the margins and questions of development and livelihoods are universal, and particularly as welfare states break down, austerity creeps in, and formal wage economies fracture, the patterns are very similar. But yeah, the basic question, who does what, who gets what, and all the rest of it, absolutely appropriately applied anywhere. So thanks for that. Yeah. Yeah, at the back.
So Ian, I think drawing from the sense of maybe the MDGs and the processes leading to that, do you think that sustainable livelihoods are achieved like forget the target for the SDGs?
Well, I think sustainable livelihoods for all would be one of those nice UN slogans that we could probably all sign up for, but never get achieved. But I think what's interesting about the shift from the MDGs that you mentioned to the SDGs are several things. The MDGs came out in the year 2000, very much constructed around an aid and development north to south framework of intervention. They were constructed around each of these goals which were expected, developing countries were expected to achieve, largely through and aid transfers of various sorts. So they provided a framework, and they provided a framework for aid that highlighted poverty and poverty reduction, which I think was useful. But I don't think they went half as far as the SDGs. The SDGs, I think, are potentially really interesting and important. For a start, they apply to everybody. The SDGs are not just a development and developing country thing. They're supposed to apply to this country as well as to Zimbabwe. So that universality provides an interesting route in to a wider debate about, how is it and why is it that people get left behind in the UK as they do elsewhere? What are the dynamics of change that are needed to result in more sustainable livelihoods over time? Whether the sustainable development goals gain wider political purchase is another question. The MDGs provided a framework for some governments and some aid agencies for the decade and a half from the year 2000. Whether in the period to 2030 the SDGs can provide a rallying call, political rallying call at an international level, I don't know. I mean, the last few weeks, months have been pretty depressing for anyone engaged in any progressive thought whatsoever. But I don't want to sort of share my depression with you in a sort of counselling session, because that could go on all day. But I think what will be crucial is for those committed to the SDG principles and those who have signed up for them to hold states to account for doing exactly what they said they'd sign up to, which is creating a more sustainable world that addresses the 17 goals together, and that at its core is a commitment to justice and reducing inequality. And that will be an uphill struggle, whether you're struggling against, a Modi government in India, or a Trump government in the US, or a Mrs. May in the UK. But it's, this is why ideas in policy are crucial. And going back to my 3 circles, it's a matter of having a clear narrative and a clear discourse. It's again a matter of creating the coalitions and alliances and networks around that, and either confronting vested interests that are opposing, but also mobilizing other interests that have that other agenda more firmly there. And certainly the United Nations has committed to this, and the world has committed to the SDGs, so there is at least a platform for that around which some of this livelihoods work, I think, can find a place. Sorry, rather long answer, because it kind of hidden behind it was quite a lot, but we've got a lot there, Francis. Yeah, anyway, please.
Why do you think it took so long for the national political level to come into sustainable livelihoods?
Good question. I think the separation of feminist thinking and sort of core economic thinking in development has been a big problem for a very long time. We always talk about gender mainstreaming, but very often it's gender adding on. And actually, what we're talking about here is not just gender in terms of relationships across genders. It's actually a much more core feminist epistemology, which takes individuals, bodies, sexual rights, and broader questions of the politics of the individual and the body more seriously. But I think, it's a classic case, rather reflective of what the livelihoods approach was trying to challenge. A siloed approach, institutionalized in particular ways. We have, appropriately, a separate gender MA at IDS and always have. But then, how do we encourage the cross-fertilization of those debates across the MAs? There's been a debate at IDS since I can remember, and I've been here for an awful long time, and that's reflected much more broadly in development more generally. So yeah, I mean, it's a reflection of the politics of knowledge and the politics of interest and the politics of networks and alliances. The three circles could be applied exactly to that question. But I think it's changing, and I think the arguments of Nancy Fraser and others who are linking more tangible material rights questions, the politics of rights, redistributions and recognition together is in a sort of more rounded philosophical manner is quite important. And of course her books were written in the 80s and 90s, so sometimes ideas take a long time to land. So there was somebody else up the top. Yes, please, and then come to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in what you had to say about how livelihoods are framed and good versus bad livelihoods, and I wonder if you could expand upon the point of so-called bad livelihoods and how they might create poverty traps.
I was talking more about normative framing of livelihoods, that people would regard certain livelihoods as bad in relation to either legal frames or moral frames and so on. So, in some sense, some contexts, sex work is regarded as a bad livelihood, a deviant livelihood, one that should be discouraged or banned or whatever. Or hunting, or is small-scale hunting is regarded as a poaching, and therefore hunters should be shot if they're capturing wildlife or so on. But of course these are livelihoods that people do, and my argument, I think, was less to say let's start with a normative or moral designation of livelihoods, so let's just understand what people do. Because actually these may be really absolutely vital ways that people make a living and survive. Whatever we think about them, we need to, as it were, separate the good and the bad. There are, of course, which is a slightly different argument to poverty traps and so on. So, that's still relevant, but I wouldn't use the good and the bad there. The poverty trap argument is essentially about how people are not able to accumulate and step up. These are the hanging in people, or indeed the people who are dropping out. So, in relation to that classification from Andrew Dorward and others, one would have to understand, well, what are the limitations of assets, of institutions and organizations, of livelihood strategies that are making particular groups of people unable to step up or step out, and actually are only just hanging in. This is a discourse, if you listen to the radio this morning, in this country, what do they call it? Jams. Just about managing. That's the hanging in. This category of people created in this country by policymakers to understand, well, who are these people and how are they managing? In a way, it's quite sophisticated. But at another level, you have to wonder underneath what's going on. But a livelihoods analysis applied to that question would be quite interesting. Oh, what's the livelihood basis of this new policy category, the just about managing, that Theresa May thinks that she's going to focus policy attention on in the budget statement tomorrow? Well, I suspect the government hasn't done a detailed livelihoods analysis, and we don't know exactly what combinations of assets and institutions create this category of just about managing or hanging in. But if it was done, it might be actually quite revelatory for policy making, just as it would in other settings where poverty traps of various sorts, it's not a term I like, poverty trap, are created. But equally, what are the opportunities for people to, over time, move out of poverty and create better livelihoods for themselves? Yes, we had somebody in the front here. Yes.
I just wanted to add for the question about the gender or your response. It's the same with environment.
Yes, exactly.
We put the word sustainable in the top of this agreement, or the point. Environment is most of the time also forgotten. I
That's pretty shocking.
I
I'll
don't
have to
know
write
if
in.
This is true, but for me, it's my feeling that it's true.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what I was saying about the politics of ecology, is that it often is separated off. But actually, if we understand how ecology and politics, essentially are mutually co-constituted, I think it's sometimes the fault of environmentalists. As soon as you have an ist, you almost then separate off. So, I mean, I think a lot of environmentalists have been at fault because they haven't they've been saying, yes, the environment's important, the environment's important, the environment's important, yes, but how do you then integrate it into a wider perspective on development? Before I came to IDS many years ago, I worked in an organisation called the International Institute for Environment and Development. One of the very first organisations with the CSE in India and others, which from the early 70s made the argument from the Stockholm Conference on that environment and development had to be absolutely seen together. But it's very easy to add words. Sustainable livelihoods, inclusive livelihoods, resilient livelihoods. In development, we're very good at making up words that can be hyphenated with any other. And it becomes a word soup, which becomes quite meaningless. So to get beyond the word soup, we have to get into it and understand, well, what's the underlying thinking of the ingredients in that soup? And that's what I've been trying to do with livelihoods and their connection to issues like sustainability, feminism, political economy, without us just sort of throwing it into the pot and hoping it will come out tasting nice. But yeah, good point. Any more? Yes, please.
These days, some of the people have questioned on the concept of the sustainability because of the changing context in the environment in terms of the climate, in terms of politics, and in terms of economic as well. So how do you think of the ideas of the sustainable livelihoods against the adaptive livelihoods?
Right, you see, this is again another question of adding words. Sustainable livelihoods slightly went out of fashion in the aid system well, as I explained in that history, in the late 2000s. What came subsequently was a much greater focus on climate change and climate adaptation, particularly as it became more and more realised, I mean, it was realised ages ago, but in mainstream policy thinking, it became more and more realised that climate change is a really sort of show-stopping story that unless we address, we're in trouble. So the Kyoto Protocol created these two-track system in climate change, one on mitigation, reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and so on and so forth, and one on adaptation, i.e. coping with the variability that climate chaos is inevitably going to result in. So there's been then a huge flurry of work since then on adaptation, community-based adaptation, adaptation this, adaptation that. The adaptation then becomes another of these words in our development word soup that gets attached to livelihoods and all the rest of it. But actually, one of my real frustrations, I have to say, right, I'm going to sound off a bit here, real frustrations in the climate debate is how little the people who moved into climate adaptation in the last couple of decades have gone back to this longer history of livelihoods. Because actually what we were talking about, not admittedly very much with a climate focus, but what we were talking about in the 1980s and others were talking about in the 1940s was very much about adaptation. It could be exactly the same. So these days there are huge conferences on community adaptation and this, that and the other, which have almost no bearing on all of this debate that went before, which is incredibly frustrating but very typical of development, which goes in fads associated with particular strands of funding and particular forms of professional expertise that coalesce around particular ideas. So if you think about ideas in development, this is one of the problems that we face in development, is we don't look back at the longer lineages of debate. This is why I went back to 1857 to really shock you. to really encourage you to think historically about how ideas come in. So, for the climate adaptation people, I'm not really answering your question, but I'm just sounding off. For the climate adaptation people, please look at some of this debate, because it's actually almost identical. And actually, the climate adaptation people could really learn a lot from this, because I think the climate adaptation debate will almost certainly go through exactly the same cycle. In about 10 years' time, realise, oh, politics, that's kind of important. Let's introduce that into the climate adaptation. So you could just, jump all of that, and which is why, Google is a real problem. You search Google, you get, a couple of references from 2013, 14, and that's your knowledge base. Well, dig further. Go to the card catalogues and the LDS. They're fun. Right, sorry, here we go.
Lately there's been a lot of attention on private sector and entrepreneurship in the creation of livelihoods and employment opportunities. What's your take on that from existing livelihoods?
Yeah, very good question. Oh, these are good questions. Again, I think this is another example. I could have given almost the same answer to what I gave to our colleague there on climate adaptation. Reinventions of wheels is a perennial problem in development. So yeah, of course, when we're thinking about bricolage, combining off-farm, on-farm, thinking about how livelihoods are constituted over time across households, between genders, this is all about entrepreneurship, actually. Entrepreneurship has that ring of the private sector and the slightly shiny. But actually, entrepreneurship is actually, all it is engaging in markets in ways that are going to improve people's ability to accumulate. So why not use a more rooted framework to understand entrepreneurship rather than assume entrepreneurship, but actually try and understand where does it emerge from. So in that sense, we have to understand markets as not things just that are out there as good, but as institutions that are necessarily political. There were long debates. I'm sounding really old, aren't I? Here. Oh, here's my long grey beard. I haven't got a long grey beard like Karl Marx, but anyway, I'll come next year with one. Markets are necessarily political and constituted through social relations and politics and so on and so forth. Markets aren't just out there, as sometimes assumed in this sort of new, shiny, entrepreneurial development literature. So yeah, markets are, going back to that framework, I'm not obsessed by this framework, but I still think it's actually quite useful. In that framework, institutions and organisations, the mediating processes by which people gain access or make use of existing assets to translate into livelihood strategies. Well, markets are a key institution in that box, but also markets are constituted in relation to other institutions, be that family, be that marriage, be that chieftaincy, be that, there's a whole array of different institutions in there within which markets operate. They don't operate as some kind of single little widget. And of course, the entrepreneur, so-called, again a term I don't like, will make use of a whole variety of different assets. So if you must use the capitals language, these will be financial assets, they will be human capital, they will be physical material capital, in order to be able to create the business, whether it's a farming business or an off-farm business, to be able to realise the outcomes on the other part of the framework. Well, that's a perfectly sensible way of thinking about all of this private sector entrepreneurship thing. But the private sector entrepreneurship thing, as you know, comes from a particular ideological discourse, so therefore it separates off the wider picture, just as the climate adaptation stuff, coming from a different discourse, separates off the way that we think around these more complex problems. And I'm not saying that we have to think about all complexity all the time, every moment, because that just becomes too overwhelming. But if you're interested in, promoting small-scale enterprises in, I don't know, urban Nairobi, then you could use this framework to think about it in a really quite concrete way. And think about, well, what type of interventions, what type of institutions, what type of asset support you're going to need in order to result in the type of outcomes that are required. So yeah, it's just, again, it's again the faddism of development creates a bubble around which we often then forget the bigger picture story that underlies it. Any more? Yes, please, go on ahead.
Yes, since you use the Marxist perspective in your analysis, and I agree with you, and it gives us kind of a vision to understand the problems. But one thing that is very clear, at least for me, in Marxist tradition, that he suggests that the only way to overcome the problems is to transcend a radical transformation in the economic system that can enable us to overcome the problem. Do you think that the problems related to livelihood can be overcome in the existing economic system?
Goodness me, these are profound questions. And very good ones, my goodness. We're going to be here all day, aren't we? Well, I'm going to come out with a hedging one here. Yes and no. I think it's sort of broader analysis of, as it were, with a historical, it needn't be a historical, I'm no Marxist, I just find some of these ideas useful, so I won't slavishly follow it, but I think, whether you take a particular historical materialist view, or you just take a broader view of historical change where, in the terms that I was using from Marx, the multiple determinations and relations relate to the concrete structural, which could be agency and structure in Giddens' terms. I mean, it doesn't. These are fairly 101 social science ideas. But if you take that perspective and analyse any setting, very often one has to, if one is to achieve progressive, radical change, particularly for those who are at the bottom of the pile, a more radical transformation is probably often required. But there are routes to getting to that. So, I think it's quite useful to have a perspective on radical transformation. This is a debate that we're having around sustainability in Step Centre. And there's a series of events that we're hosting together with a number of UK-based NGOs on trying to understand rapid transitions and transformations in historical context. So we've had events all over the country looking at rapid transformations in culture, in design, in energy systems. There's one going on in Manchester tomorrow on energy infrastructure and so on. And asking the question, well, what are the conditions for radical change where incumbent power, which is constraining the opportunities of livelihoods or sustainability, where incumbent power can be overturned? And we've seen this in the past. We've seen radical transformations in the way political systems operate, the way rights of women, LGBT people, and so on, have changed in particular societies in dramatic and often quite sudden ways in a wider historical context. What can we learn from these transformations? And often it is understanding how structures of incumbent power relate to the struggles and processes and practices of what people are doing on the ground, forms of mobilization that occur. So I think it's useful to have that bigger picture of trying to understand radical transformation, either from a Marxian perspective or from any other theoretical perspective that you like to come from. But at the same time, that's not a point to just throw up your hands and say, I can't do anything. Because actually, if you look at the histories of these transformations from whatever field, and that's what's been interesting about these transformations workshops, from a variety of different fields. It's actually continuing practicing at the margins the progressive alternatives that provide the opportunities for something to happen when it does. And one often doesn't know when that's going to happen. I don't think Mr. Trump thought he was going to get into power. But there were a lot of things that were happening prior to Mr. Trump. I'm not saying this is a good radical transition, but it was certainly it's certainly been a radical transition. There were lots of things happening in the United States polity, more generally, that were happening prior to that, which those people in the Tea Party or wherever thought were the things that you wanted to do. And I think, even if that's not the direction you want to go in, that example, you're looking disappointed now. But, if we want to imagine something else which is more progressive, then we have to do both. But I think actually an analytical perspective in development studies around radical transformation is crucial. Because otherwise we get stuck in the day-to-day and the incremental and not to say that that's not a good thing to do, because that's most of our life is occupied by that. But unless we can, as it were, have a vision that's slightly broader, we may get lost. Bad answer. But anyway, that's my perspective on it. But do check out on the STEPS websites these examples of these transformation workshops. We had a really fascinating one on something that I had no clue about before, on northern Syria and Rojava, a place of extreme conflict and war, and in this setting, under incredible circumstances, difficult circumstances, people have been reimagining and recreating a democratic alternative based on ideas from Murray Bookchin and sort of radical confederalism in this setting. And you couldn't imagine this to emerge in a setting like that, but perhaps it requires those type of experiments for radical change that we can all learn from. And I think we're going to be in deep need of seeing examples of that sort in the next period. I think we should stop there. Okay, good.